Welcome to today's explainer. Look, we're going to dive right into one of the absolute most fascinating dynamics in the machine economy right now, the gap between structural reality and market belief. In a market moving at this kind of breakneck speed, relying on old models is just going to get you left behind. If you're an allocator, a founder, or a technologist, understanding this gap is where you find your true edge. Today, we're exploring part 3 of the Machine Economy Stack Framework, or the MES, and we're focusing entirely on what happens when the underlying realities of a system stop aligning with where the market is actually putting its money and its focus. Okay, let's dive into this 6-part briefing. We're going to recap the dependency stack, look at 3 critical market assessments, and then identify the divergence signal itself. From there, we'll apply it to the layer 2 hypothesis, separate true signal from hindsight, and finally look at the divergence hiding within the layers themselves. Let's get to it. Part 1. Recapping the dependency stack. To spot where the market is getting it wrong, we kind of need to reset our baseline mechanics first. We're working with 2 foundational concepts here, dependency and gravity. Now, dependency, that is entirely fixed. It describes exactly what the system structurally relies on to function. Think of it literally like a building's foundation. Well, software models simply cannot run without the physical compute sitting underneath it, right? That is a hard dependency. Gravity, on the other hand, is completely dynamic. It describes where the dominant unresolved constraint currently sits in the system. And because of that, it's where the economic leverage is concentrated. So if dependency is your fixed map, gravity is the moving target of leverage. Part 2. The 3 market assessments. So dependency and gravity alone are great for mapping the system. They show us how the machine economy is built and exactly where its bottlenecks are. But to turn those structural observations into an actionable signal for capital allocation, we need a 3rd variable. Which brings us to our core mystery. What exactly can be learned when what the system depends on and where the leverage currently sits are pointing in completely different directions? When everything agrees, sure, the market is usually highly efficient. But disagreement? Disagreement is exactly where the edge lies for an allocator. And that brings us to our 3rd assessment, market attention. This one's simple. It just measures where investors, media narratives, and capital flows are currently focused and concentrated. It's not a claim about where value should sit or where the leverage actually is. It is purely measuring the crowd. Where is the market looking right now? When you combine fixed dependency, dynamic gravity, and current market attention, you get this incredibly powerful, testable mental model that can reveal massive systemic inefficiencies. Part 3. Identifying the divergence signal. So, what happens when we conceptually lay these 3 distinct variables over the top of each other? We really start to see the systemic friction. Look at the structural sequence in this relationship. Layer 3, logic, reasoning, and interpretation, rests heavily on Layer 2, which is energy and compute. But notice the disconnect. Our assessment shows stack gravity migrating down to Layer 2, because frankly, that's where the massive constraints are right now. You need unbelievable amounts of power and compute to run anything above it. Yet market attention, it remains heavily focused way up at Layer 3. This gap between where the structural leverage actually sits and where the capital is looking, that gap right there is the divergence signal. I really want to pause on a core philosophy here because it is absolutely crucial. The disagreement is not noise to be reconciled. It is the signal an allocator is paid to see. I mean, think about it. When dependency, gravity, and attention are all pointing at the exact same layer, the market has figured it out. The price reflects it. There is practically zero edge there. But when they come apart, that means the market hasn't resolved something yet. And that unresolved gap is the true source of alpha. Now, what's really interesting is that this divergence actually shows up in 2 distinct ways, and knowing the difference is kind of the whole discipline here. Type 1 is when the market is underweighting something that's structurally indispensable. A foundational layer the system desperately needs is just being totally ignored because everyone's attention is somewhere else. But crucially, it only becomes an opportunity when gravity actually starts migrating toward it. Type 2 is the exact mirror image. That's when the market is rewarding a layer whose current leverage might not actually be durable. They're pricing in massive leverage based on a constraint that might actually be easing up. And obviously, if that constraint relaxes, the premium just vanishes right along with it. Part 4. The Layer 2 hypothesis. Let's move to a real-world application and see how this builds. Right at the friction point between layers 2 and 3. Step 1. Layer 3, which is the realm of AI models and agents, structurally depends on Layer 2. The energy and compute infrastructure, that's just a fixed reality. Step 2, gravity is actively migrating downward to Layer 2. Why? Because power, grid capacity, and advanced compute are ridiculously hard to expand quickly. It's a massive physical constraint. Meanwhile, the models at Layer 3 are actually showing early signs of commoditization. But then we hit Step 3. market attention remains completely stuck at layer 3. The dominant narratives and the big capital flows are still obsessing over frontier models and apps. So leverage is moving down, but attention is staying up. That is a textbook type 1 divergence. Now, as an allocator, you've got to be incredibly precise here. This framework tracks migrating constraints. It is absolutely not some simplistic pundit-level claim that layer 3 lacks absolute value, or that the models don't matter. It's definitely not telling you to blindly sell one and buy the other. It makes a much sharper, more defensible point. If the gravity hypothesis is correct, the leverage is migrating way faster than the attention is following it. The bottleneck that gives a layer its leverage has literally moved, but the market's focus just hasn't caught up yet. Part 5. True signal versus hindsight. Of course, there's a really obvious objection here, right? Anybody can point to a chart after the fact and say, oh, yeah, I saw that divergence. A framework that only spots a gap in hindsight is just storytelling. It's not producing actual signals. The critical difference is that a true divergence has to be named before the market resolves it. You have to state it as a testable claim, with a very specific direction of expected migration attached. And you know what? A testable claim can fail. It can be proven wrong. A post-repricing story is just narrative wrapping paper. Holding to that standard, making the claim before the repricing happens, that is what gives this framework its actual institutional rigor. Part 6. Divergence within the layers. So, the crucial point as we wrap this up is that up until now, we've treated layers 2 and 3 like these massive uniform blocks. But those 5 primary layers of the stack are deliberate macro abstractions. They're just there to help us map the big picture. Beneath them sit highly specific sublayers, individual components, and micro constraints. And here's the real kicker. Those deeper elements, they don't necessarily share the same gravity characteristics as the overall layer they belong to. To find that pure actionable signal, we eventually have to look at the machine economy at a much, much finer resolution. Which leaves us with this final fascinating question. If we know that divergence emerges between the primary layers, is it possible for it to emerge within a single layer, long before it ever becomes visible at the macro level? That is exactly where this analytical framework goes next as we start diving into these sublayers of the machine economy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I am really looking forward to exploring that next level of depth with you soon.